Welcome to the Elaborate Topics podcast, where we focus on lab-specific strategies for medical laboratory professionals. We're proud to be the healthcare detectives that work behind the scenes to get the results needed to influence medical decisions. Let's grow together and jump right into the lab.
Hi, friends. We are back with another episode of Elaborate Topics podcast. I am your host, Tawana Wilson, with my awesome co-hosts, Lona Small and Stephanie Whitehead. Hey, ladies, how are you?
Hello.
We are excited about today's episode. We have two dynamic speakers who are joining us today. If you are going to the Lab Manager Summit, which I hope you are registered for, which will be in Denver, Colorado, April 29th and May 1st, you have to be there because you'll get to see our awesome speakers who we have on today's episode. But most importantly, you'll get to see the first time Stephanie, Lona, and I will be in the same room, in the same building, and not in a virtual space. So we are super excited about having our first time meetup live and in person since we started this podcast back in 2020. So I'm excited about that. I know they are excited about that as well. But enough about that. As you know, this podcast is a weekly show where we bring you dynamic speakers and topics each and every week. Make sure you subscribe. Do us a favor. Don't be stingy. Share this episode out with your friends so that we can all be friends and they can listen to this episode. So without further ado, I am excited to bring to you our two speakers who, like I said, will be at the Lab Manager Summit, Scott Hanton and Michelle Hoad. Hello. How are you?
Hello, doing great. Thank you for having us.
Hi, good to see you.
Awesome. I'm excited. I'm going to say a little bit about Scott and Michelle, and then I'll give them a little bit of time to talk about their background. Jump right into it. So Scott Hanton is the editorial director of the Lab Manager. He spent 30 plus years as a research chemist, lab manager, and business leader. Scott is very well-rounded. He's been in this space for quite some time. And then Michelle Hoad is the CEO of the Medical Laboratory Professionals Association of Ontario. She also has been in the space for a long period of time with over 25 years of working with professionals in the for-profit sector. But what's really dynamic is that Michelle and her organization, it's the largest organization or association in Canada. And from 2016 to currently, over the past 7 or so years, she's been able to raise the membership or grow the membership by 73%. That is pretty phenomenal to be able to do that. Scott, I'll start with you. And if you want to give a little bit more about who you are for our audience, you could take it away. And then Michelle, you could jump right in.
Thank you, Tawana. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your podcast. I think you guys are doing a great thing for this community. I'm happy to contribute in this episode. For me, helping lab managers make decisions and helping them to learn the skills that will enable their people and their labs and their organizations to thrive, that's my passion project at this point. I've done my time in the lab. I enjoyed it very much, but this second career working in media is really giving me a platform to share my experience and to help lab managers come together and share their experiences so that everybody benefits.
Hi, everybody. I guess I can say hi from up north. I'm sitting up here in Ontario, Canada. It's actually a really nice day today, against what everybody believes, that we don't have any snow on the ground. So a little bit about me. I actually come from the for-profit world. I spent most of my career there, and about 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to enter into the not-for-profit world, and I actually entered into the world of lab. And I worked for a national association at the time, and then I transitioned into this role. I think one of the things that I think people should understand is that I am a patient of the system, and with that passion is where I am able to really drive what I do. So I say that because I have had the opportunity over the last 7 years to really talk to a lot of lab professionals in our province, actually in Canada as well, and really understand what's happening in this world of lab. From a patient perspective, I can share with you that it is humbling to be a voice for this group. And I'm so excited about this conference. I can't tell you. I was actually working on my presentation today, and I'm just so excited about it. But I think I'm looking forward to the discussion today, and just really happy to be here.
That's amazing. Thank you both. And we're honored to have both of you on our platform. We're so excited to get into this conversation today. So I want to start with Scott, because I want to talk first about the 2024 Lab Management Leadership Conference. I was honored enough to attend the 2023 conference, and I had an amazing time. The conference was very informative. It offered a wealth of information. I took so many notes that I was able to bring back to my team. We've also done a podcast on how to prepare for your conference, and I'll link that previous episode in our show notes. But I want to talk about the Lab Management Summit. What can attendees expect to walk away from? What insights can they expect to get from the sessions? And how has it developed over the years to be what it is today and get to the point where you are right now?
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, we're really excited about the Lab Manager Leadership Summit as well. It's come from a bit of humble beginnings where it started with, we brought in expert speakers and we did a lab tour. And now we've added roundtables and workshops, a specific entry track that's for clinical, and we've added a safety track. So if one of your listeners out there is specifically interested in safety and risk in the lab, we've got a whole track for them as well. What we expect to happen at the Leadership Summit is for lab managers to come together to learn from some experts in a variety of fields, but also to meet one another. Lab management can be a lonely business. And many times you don't even have a peer in your building. And so it's hard to talk to people who really understand what's going on and the challenges that you face. The Leadership Summit gives you the opportunity to come together with people who are facing those same challenges. And what we've learned is that the challenges of lab management look a lot of whether you're in a hospital lab, a diagnostic lab, a clinical lab, a research lab, a petroleum lab, or a water analysis lab. It's really about getting the science and the people to all come together. What we hope is that you'll find one thing that you can bring back to your lab and practice starting the next day and make your interactions with your staff and your organization better. And if that works great, then look into your notes and pick a second thing.
Awesome. I'm going to ask Michelle, because Michelle is going to be one of the keynote speakers for the clinical track. Notice you have different tracks. And Michelle is going to be talking about cultivating resilience. And I think it's such a timely topic. Michelle, you said you were working on your presentation today. When you did your research and you looked at what some of the medical lab professionals are saying, what do you think has changed in terms of their perception, maybe pre-pandemic to post-pandemic over the years? And it's going to be a two-part, but I just want to know, what have you noticed or heard that has been changed in terms of perception with the medical lab professionals?
I think that one common, I would say, image that we have of lab that existed before COVID was that they were invisible. And I say that because people feel invisible. You go into, and you guys can appreciate this, if a member of the public walks into a hospital, they're talking to a nurse, they're dealing with the physician, and there's these doors that lead to nowhere, and there's these people back there, and nobody knows who they are. And I think the perception has always been that the public doesn't understand what they do. And I think what has happened through COVID, I like to call this the lab illumination, is there has been an understanding that there is a group of people that exists that process millions of tests every day. And I think that perception is starting to change. I was just actually at a conference this weekend talking to some government officials, and we're struggling up here with resulting pathology. And there's a turnaround time for testing with cancer. And only 50% of our labs right now are meeting that deadline. And the conversation this weekend was the understanding of what lab does now after COVID, that it's not just COVID. They do thousands of other tests in their menu. So I would think that the perception that has changed is there's more of an understanding that there is this group of people, that they're essential to healthcare, but still we have a very long way to go.
Awesome. And so I'm glad to hear that the perception has changed, not only for the public, but I think hopefully we are realizing that they're seeing us now. They're understanding that we have more to offer than just COVID testing. Based on that change in perception, what do you think, how do you think it's affecting us? Whether is it in a positive way and how?
I think
negative way.
I think it's positive for sure. Like right now, we're currently in budgeting mode in our province. So they're determining where money is going to be allocated. And there's been a focus on primary care. So all front facing professions, whether it's PSWs, paramedics, physicians, and nurses. And I believe what has happened is there's an understanding that in order for that primary care to function, you need the foundation of lab to provide those results so those primary care givers can do their job. And that, I call it a bit of a circular conversation because we come back to the fact that lab is the foundation of healthcare. And I think the perception is slowly starting to change where announcements are being made for investments in hospitals, investments in long-term care, but there seems to be a pause now saying, wait a second, do we have lab staff to support those changes? And that the dialogue is starting to change. People involved in those conversations is changing. And I think it's a slow change, but we are slowly moving towards the right direction.
Scott, I know that you are leading a workshop around investing in your team and building skills and the importance of that, and talking about building those succession plans, which we all know are pivotal and crucial in our laboratory landscape. I'm interested to hear from you of how have you seen the role and responsibilities of lab manager change through your trajectory, and you've got 15 plus years on me, and what future trends do you anticipate in lab management going forward?
Thank you, Tawana. I think this is a very important question. When I look back to the beginning of my career and my start as a lab manager, what was really expected of me was that we would deliver excellent science and that my role was really the project manager. And so the conversations were about numbers and data and spreadsheets and images and numbers of tests completed and methods that were required. Back in those days, there was almost no conversation about how were the staff behaving or what, and I never heard the word thriving, right, or engagement. It was all about them producing. And one of my pet peeves is calling researchers in the lab or laboratorians resources. A pencil is a resource, right? A laboratorian is a human, and they're not rows in spreadsheets. They're not just hands that produce work. They're humans who are giving their effort and their experience for the betterment of the organization. What is changing is the recognition that leadership is necessary. And now all the leadership skills are needed. As we think about what skills are necessary for the next generation of lab leaders and how you can do your succession plans, sure, we need smart, talented scientists, but we also need leaders who have emotional intelligence, who are humble, who will show vulnerability, who have an understanding of people's feelings, and have a motivation not just to get to the finish line of the amount of work, but to get to the finish line with a happy, united, engaged team. And so at the Leadership Summit, that's something we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the necessity of being a people leader. And most lab managers are trained scientists. They went into science maybe to avoid people rather than to lead them. And so we need to recognize those people that have that spark of energy, that are able and willing to connect and communicate and understand people and help them succeed and give them opportunities to grow those skills, so that when we're gone and the next generation of leaders comes, that they will be better at it. They will be more prepared. They will be more focused on helping their staff succeed rather than just directing them in the right direction.
That's an amazing correlation. And I think many of our listeners out there are like some of us on this podcast who, you're right, we went into our field for the science. We went into our field to work the bench, and just through happenstance of staffing, we were thrust into a leadership position, and we had all the science to be prepared to get through CAP inspections and do validation projects and write procedures, but none of the soft skills to have those crucial conversations, to encourage and motivate our staff, and even to identify and assist when somebody is quitting on the job or not being engaged. And so it's great that you all are providing that resource, that platform, that space for leaders to come and start to learn those things. And like you said, it's not just for our clinical laboratory leaders, it's important for every leader who's leading a realm in research in the laboratory. Speaking of thriving and engagement, the MLPAO is thriving. I love that Michelle mentioned lab illumination error. I love that term and that phrase. And Tawana mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that since your tenure as the CEO of the Medical Laboratory Professionals Association of Ontario, your organization has experienced exponential growth, 73%. You all are thriving. You guys are leading this lab illumination error. And so I'd like to know from you, Michelle, if you can share with us, what were some of the key strategies that you feel like contributed to that growth over your tenure, and do any of those strategies that you think of translate to skills that lab managers may be able to use in their own laboratories to help transform their own labs or organizations?
I actually, as I was listening to Scott talk, it warmed my heart, because everything you said encompasses a little of the theme of what I'm going to talk about at the conference. But so one of the things that happened as soon as I joined is the board of directors that I reported to said, we need to turn the Titanic. And I said, okay, in order to do that, I think it's important that we go out and we listen. For the first 2 years in my job, I visited as many labs as I could and asked them how things were going. Did something really inexpensive, buy pizza lunch. This was pre-COVID. And we really listened to what the issues were. And then through COVID, we had the opportunity to really acknowledge what they were saying, because a lot of the commentary coming out was they were short-staffed, morale was low. A lot of our lab leaders were talking about how do they deal with moral injury, how do they keep asking people to keep working. And one of the things that we did was we actioned what we said we were going to do, meaning we listened, we acknowledged, and then we actioned, meaning, yes, we are going to go to the government and we're going to talk about what's happening. Yes, we do hear that there's a shortage. We're going to engage in the proper ministries. Yes, we hear you. And that turned a lot of people's opinion of the association, and they joined, and I hear it every day in the conversations I have with members. Is one of the reasons why they join the association is there's finally a voice for lab. And when I translate that to leadership, I think it's something that our leaders struggle with every day. Staff that may not be engaged to come to work, they're tired, or staff that come to work and are still tired. And I think it's important for them to understand that listening, acknowledging, and actioning and telling staff what they're going to do to help with the situation goes great lengths than just saying nothing.
Amazing, amazing. I love the whole trend of the conversation starting from Scott, the whole thing about listening, emotional intelligence, empathy, being vulnerable. A few years ago, maybe Scott and I don't know, I'm almost 40 years in the field. We probably started out around that time, but that kind of conversation for managers, you would never hear that kind of conversation. And so for scientists who get in the field and they're looking for role models, it's very difficult. But I'm glad that we're having those conversations now, and we're helping the new and emerging lab leaders coming through. And I know you probably have a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of things to say. You're helping new leaders. So I just want to ask you, it's really a broad question, but what advice would you give to new lab managers and emerging and aspiring leaders at this time when it comes to their roles as managers and leaders? It's a big question.
Thank you, Lona. It is a big question. It's an important question. Let me try to give a short answer. I think there's three things that new and upcoming lab managers need to do in order to be successful in this environment, and especially if they really want to help the people and solve the problems. First, I'm going to go back to what Michelle just said. Let's start with listening. I am a problem solver. It's what I love to do. But I have in my past solved the wrong problems because I was impatient and I thought I knew better. And one of the key learnings for me is the people at the bench, they know what they're doing. They are successful, they are experienced, they have skills and expertise. And my role doesn't mean that I know more than they do. It means I have a different experience and I need to bring that experience to play. So I need to start with listening, and really good active listening. Listening to learn, listening to appreciate, not listening to reply. And then the second thing is you've got to care. You've got to care about the outcome. You've got to care about the people who are delivering the outcome. When we're talking, like Michelle is, about hospital labs and medical labs, a lot of laboratorians get into that because they want to help. They want to contribute to patient wellness. And so they are in there because they care, which means you have to care as much as they do. I heard a talk years ago by Melanie Klinghoffer, and she said, if you'll care, they'll care. And what she means by that is you need to care about them. And again, as Michelle said, you have to take action on that caring. Praise them, recognize them, help them, enable them to be successful. And then the third thing you need to do is learn, because most of us got trained as scientists. We don't know how to be lab managers. So you've got to be constantly learning, because the challenges that I've seen over my career as a lab manager just continued to grow. And I always needed new knowledge, new skills, new understanding in order to be able to tackle the new challenges that came at me. And that's why we've created the Lab Manager Academy, to give people a place to go for lab-specific leadership and management skill training. And if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me. The last thing I'll say is an early supervisor of mine gave me good advice as I transitioned to lab management. And he said, Scott, do you want to be right or effective? And the key word there is or. As a PhD scientist, my job had been to be right. That was what I was brought into the company to do. But as I transitioned to lab management, it was much less important that I was right and way more important that I was effective. And so being able to harness the whole power of the laboratory rather than just my ideas, that's what's required to be successful. And to have enough vulnerability to admit you didn't know the answer, or to ask for help, or to get other people involved, to share the stage, whatever it took so that we could be effective.
Thank you so much. That's just so awesome. And I just want to just wrap up by saying that really thank you for that initiative to start lab management. And that was a similar thing that caused us to start Elaborate Topics podcast, to talk about these topics that nobody else were talking about when it comes to those soft skills of leadership. And I think we probably should throw away the word soft skills because there are some important skills. But thank you so much.
Yeah, that was really good. I really like those 4 tips, making sure that we are listening and caring. A lot of times as managers, you hear about the outcomes, and sometimes people forget the people, right? Our most important asset is our people. And we have to keep learning, because if we're not learning, then we're not growing and making that decision of doing either what is right or effective. So you have to be the one that choose that. I know in management, sometimes there's a lot of gray, and I think that's where our people tend to struggle, especially as new managers, because it's not always black or white. Sometimes it's gray, and sometimes that fear of failure and fear of making a wrong decision sometimes intimidates new managers. Michelle, I know in your talk, don't give too much away because the people have to come to the Lab Manager Summit to get all of the details. But I know you're talking about cultivating resilience. And let's face it, sometimes as managers, it's hard, right? It's hard to be resilient. And sometimes you just want to give up. You're like, I do this. Is this role for me? I'm interested to hear, Michelle, you talk about some of the common challenges faced by lab managers that you will address during your session, and even some potential solutions or strategies for them. We always like to give our listeners some tips that they can put in place and walk away with, but without giving them all the tips from your talk, give them a few that they will be able to walk away with after listening to this.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of lab managers are dealing with short staff that are burned out and finding ways to keep them engaged, finding ways to keep them, period. And what I'm going to focus on is actually learning and understanding a little bit how each person operates, and maybe some of the challenges that the things that lab managers are good at actually works against them. So just for example, I think working in the lab is, and you guys had just talked about it, everything's black and white. Everything needs to be accurate, precise, you can't make a mistake. How can you transition that in order to deal with staff who are struggling and things are not black and white? And I'm just going to leave you with one line that we will talk about, which is, it is okay not to be okay.
That's good. And I definitely agree, because we are not going to be okay all the time. And as managers, I think that is a great point to mention. It is okay not to be okay. And it is okay not to be the problem solver, fixer for everything that's happening in your laboratory. I can't wait to your session, Michelle. I'm ready to get those other tips. Maybe I'll talk to you offline. So listeners,
you know what,
to the summit.
You know what, let me just share a story, because I know we have some time, but I hired my vice president of professional practice. She's from the lab. And in her first year that she transitioned at a lab into the association world, she had such a hard time in situations that were not black and white. Let me give you an example. So we work a regular hour week. That's sometimes we work 40 hours, sometimes we work 70 hours, sometimes we work 60 hours. And in the management role, you work and you manage your own time. She had a tough time with that. She's like, what do you mean? What if I'm working 40 hours? What do I do the following week with those hours? And I said, it all works out. She's like, I don't understand what you mean. And she struggled with, how do you balance that? And I said to her, maybe one afternoon you don't work. And she's like, what? She couldn't comprehend that. She's like, what do you mean? I'm like, it rolls like that. Sometimes you work weekends, sometimes you don't. It took her about 16 months to understand what working in gray means. And I don't mean that as a negative, because she is one of the best hires I have had since in my career. But now that she gets it, she goes, you come from a clinical setting where everything is so exact. You work in boundaries. And she said, it's so hard to think differently. And I think one thing we need our managers and leaders is they have to think, they have to bleed outside of that box. And it's hard to learn.
You made me think of a story, because there is in my organization, there's some change in leadership, and I was the exact same way. I met with one of our senior leaders, and I won't name any names, but he said, if you need any help while we're in this transition period, you can just check with me or this other VP. And I said, you or that person? Which one? I need a procedure. Who am I in lab? That's how laboratorians are. We're all very focused on procedures. But what I've loved about this conversation is that it really sounds like that through this lab Manager Leadership Summit, you're really going to be focusing on giving us tools to think a different way. And in a previous podcast, one of our guests said a quote that I love. And she said that in previous days, we would say, let's take care of our people, our employees, because it helps retention. And she said, now let's take care of our people because they're people. And I really feel like that's the theme of where we're going with this leadership summit. And so I have another question for Scott, because the lab manager as a corporation, as a company, has done so much. You mentioned the academy. We've talked about the summit. We haven't even touched on the digital forums and the online platforms that you all have. And you are doing so much in this space to help cultivate the future of lab management. And so how do you think some of those events and platforms are helping to shape the future of lab managers?
Thank you. Yeah, I think our key at Lab Manager is, what I understand from my experience as a lab manager, is it was constant decision making. And one of the biggest problems I faced was decision fatigue. For example, as when I became a lab manager, I started bringing the same lunch every day. Exactly the same. Why? It was one less decision that I needed to make during the day. And when somebody stopped me and said, let's go out to eat, okay, but you have to pick. Why? Because I don't have any more energy to make another decision today. So our content is aimed at helping lab managers make better decisions faster. And across everything, whether it's safety or products or science or tools or people or recruiting or engagement, the whole point of our content is to help people make decisions. At the live event, we want to go one step further, and that's that we want to help people network. As I said before, lab management can be a lonely role. There's few people you can complain to. There's few people who really understand the pressure. A good lab manager is like an umbrella. You're protecting your people from the storm, right? And only the weight of that umbrella. And it's really hard to share what that feels like to the people who are protected by it. When you're at the Live Leadership Summit, now you're with a whole group of people. We might have 150, 175, maybe 200 lab managers there. Every one of them understands the weight of the umbrella. And what I really like about the Live Summit is I see people connecting. I see people grouping up. I see people hanging out. And the best thing that they're doing is sharing their experience, and they're learning from one another. Yeah, we're going to have experts on the stage, and I'll teach my workshop, and Jonathan will teach his workshop. But one of the key benefits is meeting up with people who understand the burden and the challenge, and just sharing and being able to complain and whine and state your problems in a safe place with people who get it and are willing to contribute to the solution, to the outcome. And I really hope that people will make connections that they don't have to wait a year to call on, right? Exchange contact information, become friends, build a support system through people who really understand what this life that we've chosen is like. So between our content, giving you information and knowledge, and then through the connections, in order to build, a safer, stronger, more more resilient, to use your word that you used earlier, approach to these really important and difficult jobs.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to go up my alley. And based on what you're saying, you talk about sharing experience, you talk about sharing stories. And I know that it's so important to make these connections. When people realize that you have been there, done that, they can relate. And so I'm going to ask both of you, starting with Michelle, seeing that Scott just spoke, what experiences, what personal stories you probably could share that would be valuable to other leaders that would help them in their journey?
I think it's important for leadership to honk their own horns. And I just give you that as a little bit of a teaser of what I'm going to talk about. But there were a lot of situations in the last 3 years where we were given the microphone and we spoke in that microphone. And there's a lot of opportunities I think leaders have. They just need to step up and they need to speak their truth about lab, truth about what they do, truth about the importance of their work. It is not ingrained in lab naturally to do that. And I think that one of the things I'm going to talk about, and at least I can tell you personally, is that when that microphone was handed to us these last 3 years, there was lots of screaming in that microphone for people to listen. And we as lab need to learn to do that better.
Awesome. It reminds me, and that was just before the pandemic. I had it was like a series that I had on LinkedIn Live called Stepping Up and Stepping Out, because I was trying to encourage laboratorians to step up to the microphone, be visible. So I love that. And for you, Scott, what would you maybe as a teaser be sharing that people could connect with as a story?
I'm going to go back to Michelle's comment from earlier, talking about it's okay to not be okay. These are hard jobs. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of stress. There's no downtime on these jobs. We work too much. We get too little support. And the place where we're going to find the best support is with each other who really understand this. And then coupled with that is if these people are the ones who can understand us and help us, then we can be vulnerable with them. We can share with them where we need help. We can share with them what problems we're struggling with, what challenges are vexing us. And these are the people who can help us. And I'm going to do some of that in my workshop. People look at me now with all my knowledge and expertise, but that has come from making countless mistakes. I used to talk in my lab management job of why was I the general manager of the business? Because I'd made more mistakes than anybody else. And that gave me more opportunity to learn. But with each of those mistakes come little bumps and bruises and scars, right? And so people can't see all of that. But in my workshop, I'm going to share some of my mistakes and some of the ways that I didn't plan well enough and the ways that we took succession planning for granted and then we were surprised. And what I learned from that was to take a more systemic approach to skills planning and succession planning. And I want to share that with young lab managers so they don't have to endure the bruises and scars that I had to endure. And that, to me, is the whole point of paying it forward, right? People helped me in my career. I want to help others so that they can share what I've learned and go on to bigger and better things. So I think that's the best for me, as I want to share from my personal experience so that they can learn from my experience and don't have to suffer the problems that I suffered.
Isn't that the best way? Sharing your story and shortcut theirs. So that's amazing. That's a good way of giving back. Thank you.
That was awesome. Of course, we could talk with you all for hours on these topics. However, our time for today is coming to a close. Michelle and Scott, it has been a joy to have interviewed you both and have you both on our platform. I I am super excited. I know my co-hosts are as well about the upcoming summit. As we get ready to close, because we do have a global audience who unfortunately, might not be able to attend the summit, but maybe you said something, just maybe 1 or 2 or 10 tips that you said today that really resonated with them. How can they get and stay connected with you if they maybe won't be able to attend and network at the summit? Michelle, and then Scott, let us know.
So lots of ways. I am on every social media platform that's out there. Happy to connect with anybody anytime. Our website actually has my contact information. Happy to connect in any way possible.
Yeah, same. I'm happy to connect with people. My email is on our website. It's in our magazine. It's shanton@labmanager.com. Also, reach out to me on LinkedIn. And I'm really happy to engage in conversations that probe at the edges of the kinds of problems we talked about today. Things like retention and engagement and thriving. Those are personally important topics to me. And I think they need more airtime, both in our content that we publish and in social media discussions.
Awesome. So listeners, make sure you connect with Michelle and Scott. We'll also leave their contact information in the show notes so that you're able to reach out to them. As you all know, we want you to be on LinkedIn, so make sure that you look for them on LinkedIn. Also check out our Elaborate Topics group while you're over on LinkedIn. And we thank you so much for listening to this episode. Again, make sure you share it out. We would be so grateful if you did. And reach out to us. Let us know, what were your takeaways from this episode? What were your quotables from this episode? Thank you for listening. And until next time, my friends, I hope you have an amazing week.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Elaborate Topics, where your hosts discussed relevant strategies for laboratory professionals. Please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and listen to us on directimpactbroadcasting.com. Stay tuned for another episode with information you can use to excel in your laboratory career.